My name is Royden Piduk. I'll be your student moderator today. And now I have the honor and privilege to introduce today's panelists, Dr. Mariana Bujarin. Mariana Bujarin is a senior research associate at the Howard Kennedy School Belfer Center, project on managing the atom. Mariana is also a senior non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution and a member of the Committee on International Security and Arms Control of the National Academies of Sciences. She has published in the Journal of Cold War Studies, Non-Proliferation Review, Foreign Affairs, Washington Post, the Boston Globe, Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, Center for Scholars, where she is War on the Rocks, and in the publication of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, where she is a global fellow. She is an author of Inheriting the Bomb, The Collapse of a USSR and a Nuclear Disarmament of Ukraine, for which she won this year's William E. Colby Military Writers Award. Please, let's give a round of applause for Dr. Bujarin.
Thank you so much, Rudian, for this very kind introduction, and thank you so much to the organizers of this Writers' Symposium and to the entire Norwich community for putting this excellent event together and giving me the opportunity to talk about my work, this book, and also to share with you some of the thoughts of how it could be, and it is, relevant today when Ukraine is fighting a very bloody and cruel war of defense against the Russian Federation. So the whole symposium is titled Perception Wars, and we heard many excellent presentations over the past day and a half, and the word narrative keeps reappearing in many of the presentations. And narratives, what are they? They're stories that help us make sense of this very complicated, often convoluted world. So when I embarked on this research project as a graduate student, this was my PhD dissertation, or it originated as my PhD dissertation, what I encountered were two stories, two narratives about what happened to Ukraine's nuclear weapons in the early 1990s when the Soviet Union collapsed and its vast nuclear arsenal was scattered around this very giant Eurasian landmass that now was not one country, the Soviet Union, but 4 independent states. The Russian Federation being one, but also Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. So when I started looking into this history, I encountered that the explanation for what had happened had gelled into these two rather simplified narratives. One, in the West mostly, was that these were not Ukraine's weapons to give up, that Ukraine didn't have options. The outcome was overdetermined, as social scientists like to say. So Ukraine had no choices, right? It was a young country, didn't know what to do with these weapons, didn't really have much use for them. The command and control over, especially the strategic part of this nuclear deterrent, was still in Moscow. And that really, it wasn't really a disarmament. It was just a removal of these former Soviet nuclear weapons from the Ukrainian territory to Russia, where they belong. You sometimes hear, we were talking also about the power of words, repatriation. They originated there, they were repatriated to Russia. That was one narrative. On the opposite end of kind of these explanatory stories about what had happened was the narrative one encountered in Ukraine. And that was, we inherited the world's 3rd largest nuclear arsenal, and under the pressure of the United States and Russia, we gave it away for nothing but empty promises. And the emphasis on empty promises became all the more pertinent after the first Russian invasion of 2014, when Russia moved in to annex the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea and then stoked the war in eastern province of Donbass, and the West really took a very circumscribed view of its obligations in relation to Ukraine at the time. Now, Ukrainians pointed out to a particular document that was signed as part of the nuclear deal that is known as the Budapest Memorandum on security assurance to Ukraine in connection with its accession to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons as a non-nuclear weapon state. So that is to say, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons or the option to become, to retain it, joined this major international treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state, meaning it relinquished the right to have nuclear weapons and develop them in the future, in exchange for these security commitments from the two nuclear weapon states, three actual nuclear weapon states, the United States, the Russian Federation, and the United Kingdom, which happened to be also the depository states of this, of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Fast forward 20 years from 1994 when it was signed, the Budapest Memorandum is violated by one of the signatories, the Russian Federation, and the other two, they condemned this violation, they condemned what happened, they imposed some sanctions, but really find their obligations under this memorandum rather minimal. So in being confronted with these two narratives, I had to make my own sense as a military historian and a diplomatic historian of what exactly had happened and why. And it will come as no surprise to you that when one delves into the documents and tries to put the pieces of this puzzle together, the truth that comes out, a truth that comes out, is a lot more complicated and a lot more nuanced than either one of these two narratives. So I'd like to share with you briefly just three main takeaways that will be relevant, that are relevant today for this continuing story of Ukraine's security that's unfolding as we speak on the battlefields of Ukraine. From this particular historical work. And then I think I will have a chance to read a little bit to you from the book. So one takeaway is that Ukraine did have options, and it did have agency in making the decisions about the nuclear arms that were left by the Soviet Union on its territory. Ukraine was not sort of a helpless, bystander to the whole process. Not only did Ukraine inherit, intercontinental ballistic missiles armed with multiple nuclear warheads, air-launched cruise missiles carried by strategic bombers, the Tu-95s and Tu-160s, that incidentally Russia uses today to launch cruise missiles at Ukraine. Ukraine also inherited a very large chunk of the Soviet military-industrial complex. We think of Ukraine as the breadbasket of Europe, and that it was. But it also was one of the major military-industrial production centers in the entire Soviet Union. The missile-making factory in Dnipropetrovsk, now Dnipro, in eastern Ukraine, was one of three major ICBM manufacturers in the Soviet Union. At the time of Soviet dissolution in 1991, about 70% of strategic missile warheads were deployed across the Soviet Union as a whole, were deployed on Ukrainian-made missiles. The centers in Kharkiv, another major military industrial hub in Ukraine, produced targeting and guidance systems for a different kind of missile. There were enterprises in Kiev and elsewhere that contributed in major ways to producing the Soviet nuclear deterrent. But Ukraine didn't have all the pieces together. It lacked some critical links in this nuclear weapons program, which would have been costly, but not impossible, to build up. right? It would have been very costly for Ukraine at the time in the early 90s, when the economy was in shambles and political institutions were in flux, but it was not impossible. So the takeaway is that if states make in the way the calculation about their costs and benefits of any particular policy decision, if they happen upon the one that is least costly and most beneficial in those circumstances, it doesn't mean they don't have other options or that they couldn't have done otherwise. So that's one thing to keep in mind when we talk about Ukraine and its decision to disarm. Another point is that the world that Ukraine entered in 1991, with this nuclear issue being born basically into independent statehood, with this nuclear predicament of this vast arsenal of nuclear weapons left on its territory, that world was not anarchical. That world was not a free-for-all. That world had order. It had international institutions and treaties that set set a range of expectations of what it is like, what it is to be sort of a member of international community in good standing, what was expected of a new state, what were the international obligations of such a state. And the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, signed in 1968 and enforced since 1970, recognized only 5 nuclear weapon states. The United States, USSR, that was then succeeded by the Russian Federation, United Kingdom, France, and China. There was no room for any more nuclear states within this regime. So if Ukraine wanted to retain this nuclear option and hold on to at least part of this nuclear legacy, this nuclear inheritance, it would have had to do so outside of that treaty. And that space was, inhabited by countries like North Korea, and that were, the kind of rogue states, that as we call them right now, that were not exactly the company Ukraine wanted to find itself in, though the violators of non-proliferation norms. So for Ukraine to make the decision about this nuclear inheritance was as much as what it could get in return or what kind of things it could avoid, but also about what kind of country it wanted to become. It was emerging out of this, evil totalitarian empire. It was an aspiring democracy. It wanted to join the international community on good terms. And in that sense, the international institutions and norms that existed in the international public space at the time were really important in shaping Ukraine's decision to become a non-nuclear weapon state. And lastly, about the commitments made under the Budapest Memorandum. In international affairs, oftentimes, actually most of the time, agreements are what you make of them. This does not mean that, the strong do as they wish and the weak suffer as they must, as to quote Thucydides. But it does mean that there's no automaticity. One has to work to operationalize and imbue the agreements that are signed with substance. And it is my contention and argument that Ukraine perhaps neglected the Budapest Memorandum before 2014. There was a document, there was something signed, it said security guarantees in Ukrainian, security assurances in English. Incidentally, in Russian, it's also security guarantees. That semantic difference was extremely important, especially here, because for the United States political establishment, a guarantee implies mutual defense commitments. It's a very particular concept, whereas assurance is something softer. It's a reassurance to stand by the existing international commitments per the United Nations Charter, per the 1975 Helsinki Final Act of the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, right, to abstain from the use of force, any force, to respect the inviolability of international borders, sovereignty of the state, and so forth. So these were all the good things that were pledged to Ukraine, but they were really quite general. And to operationalize that agreement, it was incumbent upon the Ukrainian leaders to pursue imbuing this document with very concrete operational meaning. Now, after 2014, after its very apparent breach by the Russian Federation, it was the Western signatories who chose to make very little of that document. They could have chosen otherwise, right? They could have interpreted their obligations under this Budapest Memorandum in a more generous way. In a sense, what happened in 1994 with the signature of this Budapest Memorandum for Ukraine was that the West wrote out a blank check, right? So there was a recognition that Ukraine had legitimate security concerns and that giving up the nuclear option had security implications for Ukraine. Because if a nuclear deterrent works for the United States, or France, or China, there is really no reason why nuclear deterrence shouldn't work for Ukraine if it chose to pursue that course. But that check was blank, right? So, and when it came due, there was a choice of how much to write into the amount. And that the choices that were made in 2014 possibly contributed to the expectation of the Russian leader, President Vladimir Putin, in expecting that if he does escalate, as he did in February 2022, the West would similarly choose to write in a smaller amount, right? The amount that would not impose considerable costs on the Russians. He was wrong in that regard, but it's not crazy that he might have suspected that, given what happened in 2014. And with that, I will read a little bit from the book. Some of the passages, as you will understand, this work is very personal to me as well, because as a young student, I've lived through some of this, and now, of course, as someone who still has family in Ukraine, and still very much embroiled in what's going on there and the security issues there, this history is very much a living history for me. I will go ahead and I'll sit down. So. The nuclear age, conceived by brilliant brains in the 1890s, born in savage Hiroshima fires in 1945, and stubbornly refusing to abate since, spans 3 centuries. The strong nuclear force holds some of the tiniest bits of matter together. Humans, in their ingenuity and hubris, learn to manipulate it, to shatter matter and release enormous quantities of energy. They use that energy first in war and only afterwards in peace. After all of us, every being on Earth, are permeated by the nuclear age in the most literal sense, with a slew of radioactive isotopes from the 500 above-ground nuclear tests conducted between 1945 and 1963 lodged in our cells. But the generation of Ukrainian children who walked to school in April 1986, my generation, would be marked by the atom to a greater extent than any of us had anticipated. The Chernobyl disaster was simply too big for the Soviet regime to hide. Eventually, we learned the stories of the liquidators, of the radiation poisoning, of contamination, of hundreds of thousands resettled, and of the authorities' negligence and cover-up. Chernobyl unleashed the natural force that humans had failed to keep harnessed. Chernobyl also helped unleash another invisible but potent force: indignation. a force that moves people in search of a more just and equitable ways to organize their societies, and is capable of finding cracks in the most airtight of containment chambers. By 1991, this unrelenting force shattered the ailing Soviet Empire. Ukraine emerged from its rubble an independent sovereign agent at last, eager to join the international community. The enthusiasm of the international community to receive Ukraine into its fold was tempered by concerns over the fate of the enormous cache of nuclear arms the Soviet Union left behind there. The politics of nuclear disarmament came to dominate the first years of Ukrainian statehood. As a student of political science in Kyiv in the 1990s, I remember being conflicted in the nuclear debates that ensued. I believed that nothing good could come from nuclear weapons, and that Ukraine should ultimately get rid of them. I knew that no thing created by humans was fail-safe, and that we could not afford a nuclear failure. I knew that the loss of control over even a minuscule portion of the nuclear megatonnage deployed in Ukraine would dwarf the loss of control over the Chernobyl reactor core in scope and consequences. I suspected that nobody in their right mind could threaten a nuclear strike and mean it. But part of me was baffled by why the two states that exerted the most effort to convince Ukraine to disarm, the United States and Russia, were themselves armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons, which they earnestly believed were a force for peace because deterrence worked. That one of these states was rapidly emerging as a security threat to Ukraine made the nuclear circle even harder to square. Years later, I came to research Ukraine's nuclear disarmament, at that time an obscure episode in nuclear history for my PhD dissertation. In early March 2014, I presented to a small nuclear history conference in Switzerland. I offered some thoughts about why Ukraine disarmed and about the importance of security assurances to respect territorial integrity and to abstain from the threat or use of force pledged in 1994 to Ukraine by the nuclear states as part of the deal. I finished my presentation and pretended to listen to other panelists while frantically checking my phone for real-time developments in Ukraine, where unmarked Russian troops were taking over Ukraine's peninsula of Crimea. Trouble was brewing in the country's east and south. Would the Russian troops push further? What chance did Ukraine stand against a large-scale Russian invasion? The whole project of Ukraine's sovereign statehood hung in the balance. When the war in the Donbass erupted shortly afterward, many of my generation went to the front. One of those who walked to school with me that morning of April 26, 1986, my classmate, Taras Stelmach, was mobilized on March 19, 2014. He became a sergeant in the Medical Corps of the 24th Mechanized Brigade, deployed to the Donbass on June 4th. On August 7th, his convoy was shelled near the village of Pobyeda, victory in Russian, in the Donetsk Oblast. The Red Cross on the ambulance in which Taras accompanied the wounded made a convenient target. Taras shifted inside the vehicle into the line of fire to shield the wounded. He was hit by a rocket-propelled grenade and jettisoned from the ambulance together with the back door. There was no way to stop the convoy amid the assault to collect what was left of him. It took a while to officially establish his death. Volunteers eventually succeeded in retrieving his remains, consisting of not much more than his low-grade bulletproof vest, from the occupied territories, and had him identified through DNA testing. Taras was buried in Lviv on December 16, 2014. The following month, he would have turned 40. Taras saved the lives of 5 people. Storytelling is no match for self-sacrifice. Writing a book will not save lives. But it might rescue bits of truth from oblivion, provide consolation in understanding, and offer a glimpse of the interesting times in which my generation had been cursed with the privilege to live. April 26th, 2021. As these lines are written, the war in Ukraine enters its 4th month. On February 24th, 2022, under the cover of darkness, deception, and nuclear threats, Russia embarked on a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This was the punishment for Ukraine's cardinal sin. It existed, and the leaders in the Kremlin thought it should not. Since then, tens of thousands have been slaughtered and maimed, millions have fled their homes, and entire cities had been razed to the ground. The phenomenon of bomb shelters, air raid sirens, mass graves, indiscriminate killing of civilians, filtration camps, gang rapes, torture, and marauding have entered the daily reality of Ukrainians and those following the war on social media and television. Fascism, war crimes, and genocide in Europe are no longer concepts relegated to history books of the 20th century. They're part of the living 21st century present. But so are courage and resilience, generosity, and the steely resolve to defend against the odds a homeland from invaders, liberty from tyranny, truth from lies. Before this war is over, many more will perish. Survivors will mourn the dead and rebuild the country, or what is left of it. They will also ask what could have prevented this mass murder and wanton destruction in the first place, and what can their country do to deter any future attempts by a larger, wealthier, nuclear-armed adversary from attempting to raise it as a political entity from the face of this earth. My job of persuading Ukrainians and those in a similar security predicament that the answer is not nuclear weapons has just gotten much, much harder. May 2022. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bujarin. I will now ask a couple questions to the author. While I do so, I will also open the floor for questions. There are mics on your right and on your left. Once you have questions, please come up to them and you'll be given a chance to ask them. So my first question to you is, in your opinion, what impact did Chernobyl nuclear disaster have on the question of nuclear weapons in Ukraine?
Yes, as you heard from the excerpt that I read, Chernobyl did have a very great impact on the kind of general anti-nuclear sentiment that emerged in the lead up to Ukraine's declaration of independence. In fact, it not only contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was the leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, himself admitted in his memoirs just how much of an impact he thought the Chernobyl disaster had on Soviet disintegration. It also was co-opted into Ukraine's kind of pro-independence movement in a symbolic way. So people talked about linguistic Chernobyl and cultural Chernobyl as a metaphor for kind of the kind of destruction and negligence and undermining of Ukraine's cultural legacy that was inflicted upon it by the rulers in Moscow. And so when it was not accidental that in Ukraine's kind of founding legislature, that kind of set the foundation for this new Ukrainian state. The Declaration of State Sovereignty passed by the Ukrainian parliament in July 1990, and that's a full year and a half before the Soviet Union collapses, right? In that declaration, Ukraine unilaterally kind of said that it will become, in the future, a non-nuclear state. And that was entirely, not due to entirely unilateral. There was no outside pressure at that point, neither from the United States or Russia. And all of that was couched in this Chernobyl experience and the deep trauma social trauma that was inflicted by the disaster. In fact, when I asked the author of this non-nuclear clause, the Ukrainian member of parliament who proposed it from the podium to be included in the draft of the Declaration of State Sovereignty, he said the mood was a Chernobyl mood at the time. The mood was like that. He referenced Chernobyl specifically. And that document, that kind of initial commitment to become in the future a non-nuclear state, really framed the ensuing discussions, right? It was would have been, Ukraine sort of had this commitment trap, right? So when the Soviet Union did fall apart and the realities of independent statehood and defending it became very present, Ukrainian leaders tried to take more nuanced stance on this renunciation, but they could never bring themselves to completely renege on it.
Thank you. My next question, I think most people in this room probably asked them in their head once. So did Ukraine actually have a choice to keep the nuclear weapons? Was it actually on the table?
So as I try to argue or show in the book, and one of the takeaways was that Ukraine did have options, right? I mean, technologically, of course, we have to keep in mind, there was this view or this perception that, nuclear weapons and rocket science is something that only advanced economies, advanced societies could do, develop industrial societies. And that is plainly not true. North Korea could develop nuclear weapons, not a particularly developed, industrial country. Pakistan, India, countries in the global south, South Africa at one point possessed nuclear weapons. So it's no longer relegated to sort of the prerogative of Western, industrial societies to develop this. And the physics of nuclear weapons are the physics of 1940s. Let's not forget, it's not, it's difficult and there's a lot involved in it, but it's no longer sort of the latest cutting edge of science, not anymore. So Ukraine had the scientists that had clearances in the Soviet bomb project, right? They'd had pieces of this weapons program that it could leverage, but it would have been costly for Ukraine to invest in, say, the full fuel cycle or something that it lacked. It had indigenous uranium mining and milling, so the first little bits of the fuel cycle, but it lacked conversion and enrichment and fuel fabrication facilities. The real choice was whether to keep a hedge. Right? There's nuclear hedging, right? So coming close to it without breaking any norms, but keeping that option open. And that would involve not joining the NPT, right? You could still get rid of all the weapons, but not join the NPT and keep that option open and, invest eventually in a full fuel cycle for your civilian nuclear program, which Ukraine is a very heavily nuclearized country in terms of civilian nuclear energy, had at one point 15 reactors operating. 6 of them have been occupied by Russia since the beginning of the war, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, but it's still, at this point, before the war, about 50% of Ukraine's electricity mix was coming from nuclear. Now it's about 70% because everything else got degraded. So there were, again, something that kept coming up in our discussion of perception and kind of framings. These binary, should Ukraine have kept and should have given up these particular weapons, are often misleading because there are options in the middle. And, the politics is the art of what is possible, and often that is not, either black or white, right? Either the binary choices that we often discuss.
So now we'll open the floor for questions from the audience.
Hi, yeah, my name's Dave Warren. I'm a Norwich grad and U.S. Army retired. I really like the book. There's 2 things that make this book different than most academic pieces that you read. One, it's readable and almost a page turner. If you want to answer the question, how did we end up here? with the Ukraine situation. This explains it right, and it's very well sourced as well. You really did a nice job. What I didn't like about it, I got to the end of the book, and your conclusion is that the whole thing's a fait accompli. Although they had choices along the way, you realize at the time, and you brought it up in your opening remarks, that the Bush and Clinton administration and the Russians didn't have a choice. And certainly the Ukrainians didn't have a choice, because if they didn't give up nukes, they wouldn't have got independence, I think. And that was the bottom line to it. My question to you is, and I know you'll hate to do this, but, knowing how it is today, if you knew that then in 1991, do you think the Bush and Clinton administration and all the negotiations? I was a little mad because I was on active duty during the Cold War, and when I was reading this, why trust the Russians? And she does a great job in the book of security guarantees versus assurances, I think you put in there. There's a difference, a big difference on the part of both parties. So if you knew then what you know now, how could have this played out differently where we wouldn't be both feet in a war today, with Russia and Ukraine?
Well, thank you so much for your kind words about the books, and your criticism is well taken as well. Counterfactuals are always so tricky, right? There's one school of thought that says, well, history happens the way it happens because it had to happen that way, right? All of the things, people make certain decisions, something influences them to make those decisions that moment, that time, and then kind of that joins kind of the river of history that goes a certain way. Now looking back, I wonder, readers of the book, and you probably too, you probably sensed a change of tone in the bits that were added after the full-scale invasion, right? So on one way to look at this, certainly from the US standpoint, is a great accomplishment in non-proliferation. That was, was an argument out there that nuclear non-proliferation has been part and parcel of US grand strategy, no less, over decades, ever since the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons was put in place. So here you have this really innovative policy by Bush and Clinton administrations where money from US defense budget is appropriated and given as technical assistance to destroy dismantle the weapons under arms control treaties and, to denuclearize, as, again, the word I don't particularly like because it implies nuclear disarmament seems to have agency behind it. The state decided to disarm. Denuclearize meant that somebody went in and kind of cleaned up Ukraine from this nuclear debris. So from that standpoint, US policy was really quite quick on its feet in a very, very difficult situation where its arch rival was falling apart. Creating all sorts of nuclear risks. But there were very considerable blind spots, which I hope my book conveys. And that is, again, a perennial conflation that had been, been so ossified, so internalized by the policy establishment and the broader publics in the West, is the conflation of the Soviet Union with Russia. If you read even the Cold War texts, these two concepts are used interchangeably and have been. Because, of course, people who did arms control, who were engaged with the Soviet Union, they traveled to Moscow, and Moscow is Russia. And so there must be, all there is to it is Moscow and Russia. And that probably, these other people that lived on the periphery didn't make much difference to US policy for many decades, in its Soviet engagement with the Soviet Union. But very suddenly they did. By the end of the 80s, they were making all of the difference. They were pulling this empire apart. And these blind spots, these that were created by this perennial conflation and decades-long engagement with Moscow directly, created difficulties to formulating policy to these new sovereign states that appeared on the scene in 1991. Right? It was almost as if the earth suddenly opened up and out came the Kazakhs and the Armenians and the Georgians. And people in Washington were like, who are these people? What do we do with them? How, they're making claims. They're saying these nuclear weapons are theirs to give up. How dare they? I mean, we only know that this was a bilateral matter always. So to give credit to the decision makers at the time, they were quick studies. They learned that it was counterproductive to deny these claims. And actually, the Americans came around to acknowledging that actors like Ukraine and Kazakhstan and Belarus had legitimate claims to these legacies. That, yes, there was a fine line to acknowledging these claims without actually recognizing them as nuclear, sort of legitimate nuclear powers. But you couldn't just deny the obvious. These weapons were on their territory. They controlled the borders. They could prevent anyone from coming in and doing anything with these weapons. And Ukraine certainly had the capacity to establish command and control over some of these systems. It had enough industrial and scientific capacity to do that. It chose not to because it would have been costly, but it wasn't because it was impossible. So now looking back, basically, have better understanding of the people you are working with. Know their history. This is something, you as students and cadets do. You have to know the people you engage with. You have to sympathize and have, we talk about strategic empathy to Russia. Well, I think everyone needs a little strategic empathy, and that must be based on solid knowledge. We used to have area studies. That kind of fallen by the wayside. How do we know of the people we engage in when we go into Afghanistan? What do we know about their history and their language and their concepts and ways of thinking? But, U.S. is a powerful country, and it shapes outcomes disproportionately all around the world, and it did so also in Ukraine. So a very long-winded and unsatisfactory answer to say, if we want these outcomes in international politics to go differently, we really have to invest in the kind of brain power that might create different options, that is not sort of framed in these conservative ways, right, that adapts to the new realities quicker.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I will defer to General Broadmeadow.
Thank you, David. Mariana, thank you. That was a terrific presentation so far. I just bought the book, by the way. I'm sorry I have not read it yet, but I promise it's delivered. It's delivered Saturday. I'll start it Sunday. I want to kind of change the aperture a little bit just to talk about NATO and NATO's role, and kind of a three-part question. So, one, in your research as you were doing this, you talked about the U.S., the Soviet Republic, and Great Britain, and you didn't mention anything about NATO and any kind of NATO influence. And I know it was kind of nascent back then during the breakup about NATO membership, and it would be kind of hard to envision Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania as members of NATO at that point. But did NATO factor into that at all, into the decision? Secondly, kind of today, should NATO is there some kind of NATO influence in there? And then kind of looking forward, because we look at history in order to begin to look forward too, right? As we look at this and the security agreements that were not honored, to get better security guarantees in the future, should NATO weigh in some way to supplement these guarantees that were not met or turned into assurances instead, as we look to the future, with looking at what Ukraine did as kind of leverage toward either NATO membership or NATO guarantees.
Thank you so much. That's a great and very loaded question. So very quickly, because I understand we don't have a ton of time, NATO back then in the early 90s, certainly there was a big question, what's going to happen to NATO, right? The Warsaw Pact fell apart. Was there even a purpose for NATO in this post-Cold War order? The decision, incidentally, the decision on the announcement that NATO will consider expansion to former Warsaw Pact countries, the Visegrad Four, Poland, Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, and then Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary at the time was announced at the same summit of OSCE in Budapest, where the Budapest Memorandum was signed. So these things sort of developed interconnectedly, but simultaneously, not particularly directly connected. There was no really chance for Ukraine to negotiate some kind of future NATO membership in a way of guarantee, a security guarantee, since it was just too far from both the imagination of Ukrainian leaders at that time. The popular opinion in Ukraine was not particularly supportive of NATO membership in the 1990s. But there was a desire to integrate into kind of broader European, Euro-Atlantic, if you will, structures in some way, because that was seen as sort of the way toward the future, kind of the democratic types of well-governed, if not democratic, but well-governed, prosperous kind of models of statehood that Ukraine wanted to emulate. In terms of security and the way NATO played into the decision to disarm, there was a new program that was started at the time, Partnership for Peace, to engage and cooperate with the former Soviet states. And again, it wasn't even clear what this Partnership for Peace was going to be. Was it going to be an ante-room, a waiting room for NATO membership, or was it a substitute for NATO membership? It was a consolation prize for NATO membership. Certainly, Poland and Hungary and the Czechs decided that that was not nearly enough for them and rushed headlong towards a full NATO membership. So Ukraine became a Partnership for Peace member, but it was understood that this was no substitute for an actual guarantee. Just very briefly, the whole narrative of a NATO expansion caused this war, I strongly disagree with from what I see as a historian. Did Russian leadership, and in particular President Putin, likes this? Absolutely not. It was a huge irritant. He doesn't like it one bit. Would the invasion of Ukraine still happen if Poland and the Baltic states were not NATO members? And if Ukraine was given some kind of nebulous promise at the Bucharest summit? I think it would have. It comes from Russian imperialist, neo-imperialist conquest and drive, not from any kind of conceivable fear of being surrounded by NATO or encircled by NATO. And in the future, Ukraine certainly has its sights set on NATO because it feels that that's the only real possible answer to its long-term security. And it's hard to argue with that. It's really hard to find an equivalent alternative.
Thank you so much. We do not have any more time to answer the questions. However, I want for the people to hear your questions. So if you could please voice your questions, you might have some times after the panel to chat with author and get your answer.
My question is somewhat different. I'm interested in the research and writing process in terms of asking questions, doing research, organizing research and writing. What is the most challenging and most rewarding phases of that research process? And we can talk later.
Let me just say one word: difficult and long. Thank you very much.
My question was regarding the likelihood or a chance of a new Ukrainian nuclear program, or at the very least, stationing of foreign nuclear weaponry in Ukraine to act as a deterrent, given, say, NATO membership?
Low likelihood, I would say, but we can discuss later.
So let's give last round of applause. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming.